Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I release a legacy video every Friday. Hello everyone, Martin here back with another video. This is a legacy video and a bit of an experiment. So I'm going to be making a Modern Horizons 3 preview video. So a few caveats. The cards I'm going to go through here, I'm going to go through them through the lens of a Doomsday player. So there are many cards in this set that may or may not end up impacting Legacy in a big way. I'm not going to go through all of them. I probably will not be aware of some of them. Some of them might be like sleeper cards. Some of them I'm deliberately not going to go over, even though they will likely impact Legacy, because I don't think that there is an angle into Doomsday. So with that said, let's jump into it and talk about the first card. So the first card I want to talk about is Vexing Bauble. Vexing Bauble reads, Artifact, mana value 1 generic mana. Whenever a player casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, counter that spell. And Vexing Bauble has the activated ability of 1 generic mana, tap, sacrifice Vexing Bauble, draw a card. So when looking at Vexing Bauble, it's not really easy to get, I think, a full grasp on all of its potential applications and the strategic significance that I think it might have in the Legacy format. But let's try and look at some of the areas where it could be useful to consider the card and its potential impact. Because I think at a glance, this card looks to have been designed to combat specifically cards like Grief, but I think it will have a lot of splash damage. So what decks or archetypes want this card? I think this is the quintessential question. So let's try and break this down by macro archetypes, and probably I won't go through all of them, but I think some of the most significant ones. So the first macro archetype I have named Control/Tempo decks. I could also have named them Fair Blue or something like this. This is a major strategic column of the Legacy format. The quote-unquote police officers of the format, if you will, due in large part to the card Force of Will. It seems then unlikely that these decks will want Vexing Bauble. Sure, it has some great applications in stopping Grief and zero-cost artifacts, but the fact that it shuts down your own most potent line of defense in Force of Will seems mostly to make this a non-starter. And I'm going to make a grade here. I'm going to make a grade on all of these on the likelihood of seeing play. And just to caveat that, I don't mean the likelihood that this will see play somewhere at some point in time, because obviously all of these cards are interesting enough that people will try them out. But this is the likelihood of it seeing play in Legacy main decks or sideboards once the dust has settled and we know a bit more. And I would say the likelihood of Vexing Bauble seeing play in Control/Tempo decks is 2 out of 10. Alright, Stompy decks. And here I primarily think about Moon Stompy. There are different permutations of this archetype, and it might mean that one type will be more Bauble friendly compared to the other. But I will approach this with the classic Moon Stompy shell in mind. So at face value, it would appear as though playing Bauble clashes a little bit too heavily with Chalice of the Void, which is probably Moon Stompy's most potent lockpiece, as it's a 2-mana spell that impacts many games of Legacy and can come down easily on turn 1. It does, however, synergize very well with the core strategy of locking your opponent out with force check spells. If you are the blue mage and your Moon Stompy opponent plays a turn 1 Vexing Bauble, you probably will have to force it, if you can, or have the rest of your Force of Wills and of Negations be rendered impotent for the rest of the game. The fact that Bauble replaces itself, if attempted destroyed, is quite, well, vexing. The main issue with Bauble in Stompy decks is that it doesn't really act as a prison piece in and of itself, except for versus niche decks with lots of zero cost artifacts. Instead, it blanks Force of Will effects and Force of Vigor in opponents' hands. But if it's a choice between dropping a turn 1 lock piece or dropping this and then dropping uncounterable lock pieces on turn 2, quote unquote uncounterable, I mean, they can still get spell pierced or whatever, I'm not sure it's really impactful enough. I think the likelihood of this seeing play in Stompy decks is somewhere around 5 or 6 out of 10. Moving on to spell-based combo. This is a broad and varied category, typically but not exclusively spanning the Storm combo decks, Doomsday, Show and Tell, and Reanimator. Common for some of these decks is that they usually play either zero cost artifacts, free permission and force of will, or both. As such, at the surface, it would seem that Bauble isn't the most obvious fit here. However, being able to blank opposing force effects is very powerful, and could lead to these decks being restructured to either rely less on zero cost artifacts, or to rely on Veil of Summer, which would allow these to be cast through the Bauble. I think it is most likely that a new or very rethought kind of glass cannon deck might emerge that wants to play Bauble, but I have a hard time seeing that harmonize with the zero cost artifacts. Or rather, those decks would want to go off turn 1 as often as possible to avoid the pesky cards like Spell Pierce and Flusterstorm, which Bauble doesn't protect against, and cards which are likely to see more play because of Bauble. As such, you probably need zero cost artifacts to consistently enable turn 1 combos in most cases. And then we again have to ask ourselves if Bauble and zero cost artifacts can coexist, or if Bauble is too hostile. With regards to Doomsday, I could see this being quite interesting to try out versus control and especially tempo decks. This is kind of a one mana defense grid in that your tempo opponent in particular almost 100% has to counter this on the spot. If it slips through, all of their forces and daces are dead. The fact that it can also be used to draw a card post-Doomsday is not just flavor text. If you have the mana, it will allow you to slip through a turn quicker, and as you will be sending Thassa's Oracle through a Cavern of Souls, you will no longer care about their forces getting turned back on. It also happens to turn off Pitchcast Endurance, as an aside. I will definitely be trying this, but it is anyone's guess at this point what will happen here. I would say likelihood of seeing play is probably around 6 out of 10. Then there are the Urza's Saga style decks. This is the last macro archetype I'll be going through. It is obvious that any new 1 or 0 mana value artifact with application in Legacy necessitates a discussion about its relevance with Urza's Saga. There are some Urza's Saga decks that we can likely scratch off right away. Mostly here I'm thinking about Urza's Saga decks that utilize zero cost artifacts like 8-cast and Saga Storm decks. Obviously, innovation happens, and maybe those decks will find a way to adapt Bauble, but I find it unlikely. For me, that leaves 2 primary Urza's Saga decks that I would like to discuss. The first is Painter. While Painter plays some zero cost artifacts like Lotus Petal and or Mox Opal, it feels like the zero cost saturation is not incompatible with Bauble. Having a cheap and tutorable effect like this that largely sidesteps your own plan and shuts off opposing pitch counters, as well as stuff like Solitude, Force of Vigor, etc., seems pretty interesting. Furthermore, it can act like a draw engine with Goblin Welder in a pinch. I would say likelihood of seeing play is probably 7 out of 10. And the second deck is lands. I would imagine that lands players don't typically enjoy playing versus storm decks. This is, at least in part, the reason I imagine why lands players started playing main deck Sphere Resistance. Ironically, Sphere in Bauble is a non-bow because Sphere will always make a spell cost at least 1 mana, meaning Bauble no longer sees Lion's Eye Diamond and won't counter it. I do, however, see this being quite good for resolving haymakers versus control decks, like Choke. I think lands players will definitely be trying this, and I think the likelihood of it seeing plays around 5 or 6 out of 10. In summary, I think Vexing Bauble will most certainly see play in Legacy. It has the potential to uproot the current paradigm, as it is a one-mana artifact, meaning everyone can play it, that completely shuts off Force of Will, the quintessential Legacy card. However, it remains anyone's guess if the impact will be this huge, or if it will end up only finding a home in one or a few niche decks, or as a sideboard card for decks to bring in, either to protect against combo or to facilitate it. I do think it will increase the strategic value of cards like Spell Pierce and Flusterstorm, and maybe even other less known cards of that type. Okay, second card, Necrodominance. Necrodominance is a legendary enchantment which costs black, black, black. Skip your draw step. At the beginning of your end step, you may pay any amount of life. If you do, draw that many cards. Your maximum hand size is 5. If a card or token would be put into your graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. First, I want to talk about this card from a Doomsday perspective. For Legacy Doomsday, I think this is a very exciting card. On the surface, it is quote-unquote fixed Necropotence, a card I personally have been pining for ever since I picked up Legacy Doomsday. For some context, Necropotence is restricted in Vintage and has for a long time been the quote-unquote fifth Doomsday, or the fifth black, black, black business spell in Vintage Doomsday. It's a very powerful draw engine that, if resolved early in the game, will often let you draw 12 to 14 cards and sculpt the perfect 7-card hand that lets you win on the following turn. Let's just quickly break down the key differences between Necrodominance and Necropotence. Dominance draws cards where Potence puts them into your hand. Immediately, this is almost exclusively a downgrade, in that Dominance is shut off by cards like Spirit of the Labyrinth, Narset, and Leovold, and is taxed by Bowmasters and Sheoldred. Furthermore, Dominance makes it so your maximum hand size is 5 instead of 7. This is likely a crippling downgrade, as the vintage trick of resolving Necropotence and sculpting the perfect hand is a lot less potent, with 5 rather than 7 cards. This final bit is what I'm mostly unsure about, and I will have to test. It is my expectation that this will end up falling short of Legacy Doomsday standards, and that the One Ring, for instance, will simply be a preferable card for a similar purpose, even as if it is 1 mana more expensive. It is also worth remembering that with Necrodominance in play, passing the turn with Doomsday is extra demanding, as you do not get a draw step ever again, actually. So, included in the 5-card hand, there likely needs to be Doomsday, mana to cast it, probably protection, and a way to draw into the pile. I'm skeptical, but I will certainly try it. And I say the likelihood of seeing play in Legacy Doomsday is probably on the low end, maybe 4 out of 10. I think Necrodominance could see play in other Legacy decks. I think it's possible that someone will cook up a deck that either plays, for instance, Born Upon the Wind, or Leyline of Anticipation, or some other enabler that lets you combo off in your end of turn. Because the maximum hand size being 5 doesn't come into effect until you actually end your turn and go to clean up. So you can keep all the cards you draw, and you can cast any of them that are instants. I am somewhat skeptical about whether such a deck can be built to be better than like tier 2.5 or 3. And I would say the likelihood of seeing play is probably also around 4 out of 10. So in summary, I would say that, well, as you can tell, I pretty much only see this card having potential as a combo engine. I have not considered it as a card in other macro archetypes, but I suppose it could be that a deck like Pox or Helm combo would want to try this. I am afraid they probably made this just about safe enough to not actually break through the barrier to entry in Legacy. So next, I want to talk about two cards. These are Psychic Frog and Barrowgoyf. Psychic Frog is a blue-black creature. It is a 1 power 2 toughness, and says, whenever Psychic Frog deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, draw a card. It then has 2 activated abilities. First one says, discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Psychic Frog. Second one says, exile 3 cards from your graveyard, Psychic Frog gains flying until end of turn. Barrowgoyf is a black and 2 star +1 star creature. It has Death Touch and Lifelink. Barrowgoyf's power is equal to the number of card types among cards in all graveyards, and its toughness is equal to that number +1. Whenever Barrowgoyf deals combat damage to a player, you may mill that many cards. If you do, you may put a creature card from among them into your hand. And having these two grouped together only really makes sense from a Doomsday perspective. One, Frog is likely to see main deck play in tempo decks in Legacy, whereas I believe Barrowgoyf has a more narrow application. So let's talk about them in Doomsday. I think both of these cards are pretty interesting, and I envision them stepping into the arena alongside other black and or blue creature cards already seeing either main deck or sideboard play, such as Orcish Bowmasters, Dothy Voidwalker, Sheoldred the Apocalypse, and Murktide Regent. Barrowgoyf having lifelink and costing Dark Ritual mana is very good, especially versus tempo decks that will have very limited means of removing it. Being able to mill over another Goyf or a Sheoldred is also pretty powerful. The mill is optional, so you don't feel like your deck has enough creatures. You can just choose not to mill. The Frog is also just a must-answer threat, and one that can let you draw into the pile. It also has the quirky ability to remove your graveyard in 3-card chunks at instant speed to potentially counter endurance. I think the likelihood of these seeing play is certainly there. For Goyf, and this is in Doomsday mind you, I would say it is 6 out of 10, and for Frog, probably 5 out of 10. Finally, I want to talk about a few cards that you should keep your eyes on in terms of they have strategic implications against Doomsday. The first card is Consigned to Memory. It's a blue instant. It costs blue. It has Replicate 1, which means that when you cast a spell, you may copy it for each time you paid the replicate cost. It says counter target triggered ability or colorless spell. The second card is an artifact called Disruptor Flute. It costs 2 generic. It has flash. It says as Disruptor Flute enters the battlefield, choose a card name. Spells with the chosen name costs 3 more to cast. Activated abilities of sources with the chosen name can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. And finally we have Trench Post. Trench Post is a land locus. It has tap to add a generic mana, or rather, a colorless mana, and then it has the activated ability of 3 generic mana tap. Target player mills a card for each locus you control. Let's start with the last one, the Trench Post. This is, I think, only really relevant as a card out of 12 posts. And I think it's worth noting that 12 posts also get a few other cards in the set. And I think 12 posts is going to get like just an overall lift from Modern Horizons 3. 12 posts have always struggled immensely against Doomsday. So them having this card certainly is an improvement. It's something you can kind of see coming, and you have the ability to fight over stuff like Expedition Map and Crop Rotation, and even Elvish Reclaimer. And it also is a little bit of a steep activation. Obviously, not if they have other like post lands around, but I'm not overly worried. But this definitely does move the needle um, in 12 posts' favor. Although I still think it remains firmly in the favor of Doomsday. Disruptor Flute. This is, I think, a pretty strong card versus Doomsday. And it is just another 2 mana value flash thing that we have to contend with. I don't expect to see this widely played in sideboards. I think people will try it out, but I'm not too concerned that this will be a card that we will have to face a lot of the time. I think its applications outside of versus Doomsday is maybe just a little bit too limited. There aren't many people playing Meddling Mage right now, or Pithing Needle, or Sorcerer's Spyglass. This having flash is all, like obviously really good, but I'm not overly concerned. We shall see. Be mindful of 2 open mana out of like, artifact decks. Alright, the Consign to Memory. This obviously is a way to counter the Oracle trigger, and Replicate is pretty interesting. So basically, if an opponent has, say, 3 blue duels open, or just 3 lands and one of them is a blue duel or whatever, they can cast this and basically copy, like, it almost like you build your own storm. So you will have 3 stifle effects targeting your Oracle. Having said that, I I don't know. I don't envision this seeing that much play in Legacy, but I could be wrong. It depends, I think, on how much the colorless spell thing becomes relevant. And if it is relevant, then I think this might end up being like a 1 or 2 of in blue sideboards. But we can still, I think, maneuver around this. But it is certainly an interesting card. I think out of the 3, it's like maybe the one I'm most worried about. But I I'm not I'm not overly concerned. I guess would and that's probably like the headline for this section. All right. So with that said, I want to say thank you very much for watching. I look forward to playing with these cards. I look forward to seeing where Legacy winds up with Modern Horizons, and I hope to see you there for the exploration. Stay safe. Have a good one.